Okay, well, I'd like to begin. Since it's 1 o'clock, we like to start and hopefully end on time. Depends on how wordy I get, I guess. So anyway, welcome to all of you. Thank you to St. Timothy for providing this venue. Thank you for the AV crew for enabling us to be able to see the slides, and hopefully you can hear me since I have a microphone. And also, thank you for Sister Mary Dellison for setting up all of the mechanics of this whole program. So thank you. So our topic today is loneliness. If we can see that next slide. One of the issues is why talk about loneliness? I mean, it feels bad, we all understand that, but lots of things in life don't feel good. But it turns out this is much worse than it just doesn't feel good. And I'll get into that in a moment. But first, let me just make a distinction between being lonely and being alone. You can be alone, but not feel lonely if it's your own choice. It's called solitude. You choose to be alone for whatever reason. On the other hand, you can be lonely when you're surrounded by a lot of people. So a few people in this room might be feeling lonely, and yet there are a lot of people in this room. So it really depends on whether there's a disconnect between the kinds of people relationships that you're able to have and versus the ones that you feel that you need. Next slide. You can actually leave the slides on if you want. So it turns out that the Surgeon General of the United States, his name is up there, when he first was assigned as that job, he traveled around the country and he just talked to random people to find out what their health care needs were. What were they concerned about? And he said that he was blown away by the number of people who said to him that they were lonely, they felt isolated, invisible, nobody would see them. They felt insignificant. And if I disappear tomorrow, no one will even notice. And he was just really struck by that. He would have thought they talked about heart disease or diabetes or something. No, it was loneliness and not mattering to anyone that was really the issue. Next slide. So what he did is he put together a team of experts to analyze and study this topic and come up with some recommendations of what can we do with what he sees as an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. And of course, it got a lot worse with the pandemic, thanks to social isolation and that sort of thing. And what the group found was that half of all adults experienced lonely prior to COVID-19 and a higher percentage afterwards. And he says if we don't address this epidemic of loneliness, we're going to remain separate and feel angry, sick, and alone. We must do something about it. Next slide. So what are the ill effects of being lonely besides it just doesn't feel good? It turns out it's very bad for our physical and our mental health. People who are lonely have more heart disease, high blood pressure, strokes, diabetes, infections, dementia, and mental disorders like depression, anxiety, suicide, and self-harm. People who are lonely do worse at work and at school. They are less involved with their community, less civic activity. They make less money, and they have lower well-being. Next slide. It's not a good thing. So I put together this bar graph to illustrate it. The tallest one that's on your left, that's loneliness. And the higher the bar, the worse it is on your health, physical and mental health. So you see that's the highest bar. The one next to it is smoking. Now, it does look a little bit worse than loneliness. For those of you who are interested in statistics, unfortunately, their intervals overlap, and so they're not statistically different, but being lonely is at least as bad for you as smoking, and probably a bit worse. And then the others involve things like not exercising, other kind of things that you do for your health. They're all less dangerous to you if you don't do those things than if you do experience loneliness. So it's not just, oh, it feels bad, but it's really going to impair your physical and mental health. Next slide. It can also affect your personality if you're lonely for any significant amount. Some people become suspicious and feel contempt, and aggression may even occur. That's fortunately a minority of lonely people. Most of them feel just badly and sort of want to withdraw. They may feel diminished. A sense of self-worth is decreased. They're not as self-confident. And some of them are actually ashamed of being lonely. And that's one of the reasons why they withdraw. They think if you're a good person, an outgoing person, and you're authentic, then you're not going to be lonely, right? But I'm lonely, so I must not be like that. And they're ashamed. And when they have relationships, they're more troubled if they're lonely people. Next slide. So there was also a study done at Harvard University. It's called Making Caring Common. And what they found was that 36% of all Americans were lonely most of the time, and another 37% were lonely at times. So well more than half of people. 61% of young adults ages 18 to 25 are lonely. Now, you might think that it should be the elderly that are most lonely because, their kids have left home, some of their friends have died, they may have a spouse who's died. Shouldn't they be the most lonely people? And you might think that would be true, but it isn't. Now, they do have a high level of loneliness, but not as high as young adults do. And I'll get into the details of why that may be in a moment. Mothers with young children also experience a lot of loneliness. It used to be when all families used to stay in the same community near each other, and the grandmothers would be back and forth and all. A lot of times they feel rather alone. Next slide. There's another study. It's a study on adult development. It's the oldest such study that's ever been done. It's ongoing. 85-year research project so far, and the directors have changed over the years. The senior director is always a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, and that's true now. And what they wanted to know by following these people over time was what actually makes people happy and live longer. That's what they were trying to find out. So what they started out with is asking sophomore students at Harvard University if they would be willing to participate in this. And they would take some psychological studies, they'd have a complete physical exam and some laboratory testing to find out what their baseline health is like. And they followed them every year doing those same things until they would die. And so that's adult development. Now it turns out that all medical students at the time were male, so they decided to invite their wives to participate, and they did. And they also said, well, a lot of people that get into Harvard tend to be from upper classes, and we really want to find out what's true regardless. So they went into some of the poorer communities in Boston and recruited a bunch of young men and women to participate as well. So it's the full spectrum from impoverished individuals to very wealthy ones. And they found that certain things make some difference, the quality of your career, whether you're married or not. By the way, good marriage is really good for your health. You live a lot longer, it turns out. But it's actually not what your career is. It's not money or self-care that determines whether or not you're happy in your life and live longer. It's the quality of your relationships to other people. That's number one, and it's overwhelmingly true. It's not like close to any of those other things. So if you want to be a happy person and live as long as you can, you want to work on your relationships. Now imagine the problem if you're lonely. That's one of your challenges, is that you don't have enough positive relationships. Next slide. Can you do the next slide? Yep. It's not happening, huh? Oh, you got it? Okay. There we go. Okay, thank you. So who's at risk for being lonely? Well, we know that adults over age 65 are more socially isolated, and being socially isolated increases your risk of being lonely because you're by yourself and you're not interacting with other people. I already mentioned that young adults are twice as likely to be lonely than the elderly. People without a religious affiliation are also more likely to be lonely. This is partly because if you belong to a church, you're part of a community then, and you can form relationships there, and you don't feel alone because of your religious community. Being of lower economic status also is a risk factor for being lonely, and mental and physical disabilities can also be an issue. For example, if you have trouble with ambulation, you can't get around, you're more likely to be kind of stuck at home unless you can work out special ways to get around other people. Next slide. Mothers with small children, we already mentioned. Marginalized groups, for example, Chinese in this country, as a minority, but also they have a lot of prejudice against them, it turns out, and they have a higher incidence of being lonely. Living in rural areas, and that's because of the distance involved with individuals. Victims of domestic violence have a lot of loneliness, and one of the main reasons is that the violent offender usually forces their partner to stay at home, to not interact with other people, because they don't want anyone to know that they're being abusive. And then people living alone, which is almost a third of all U.S. households, people live by themselves. So that would be kind of an obvious reason why they would be lonely. It turns out that human beings, we are a species that needs to be with others like ourselves. So human beings need one another. We're totally interdependent. When we were first developing as a species, we lived in clans of about 150 people. That turns out to be an optimal number for you to be able to know everyone in your group. And they were dependent on one another simply to survive. And so our brains have developed to demand, require relationships with other people. And so when that's missing, we have serious problems. And so one of them is the fact that we feel like we're in a flight or fright response because of danger. I'm not around people who know me and care about me. And that's putting my life at risk. That's what our brains are telling us, essentially. So we're in a constant fight or flight response, which means our cortisol levels go up and stay up. Now, going up temporarily when there is a real danger is a valuable thing. It's helpful. But when it goes up and stays up and you're not in any actual danger, that's very serious and it adversely affects your physical and mental health. So, for example, it causes chronic inflammation. It causes your immune system to become impaired, so you're more susceptible to infections and to cancers and things like that. More likely to put on weight, to get diabetic, high blood pressure, hardening of the arteries, muscle weakness, and more likely falls. Mood may often change. You may feel depressed, anxious, or irritable, and it's an increased risk for dementia. So those are the problems with having constant high levels of cortisol, which is what you experience if you're in a chronic stress state. And people who feel significantly lonely tend to be in a high constant stress state. So that's one of the reasons why people have serious health problems when they are lonely. Another reason is that people tend to decrease their care of themselves. They're not as likely to have a proper diet, not as likely to exercise, and not as likely to seek regular health care. Next slide. Another risky group would be during life transitions. If you move to another community where you don't know anyone, that would make sense. Changing jobs. Getting married, you might think, well, I have a partner around me all the time, and that's true, but it may also take you away from current friends. And getting divorced, which happens at least to half of all marriages, is a situation where loneliness often occurs. Social crises can lead to loneliness, and we saw this during COVID, where people had to socially isolate, kids weren't going to school, people were not going to work in person, and that leads to loneliness, and it's gotten dramatically worse because of that. During a major storm, people can be lonely. You can lose all of your possessions. You're kind of adrift, and you may be at some distance from people that you know and you care about. And then finally, being a member of Generation Z, they were born in 1997 to 2012. They are actually the loneliest group in the United States, significantly more so. And people wonder, well, why is it? They're young, they're healthy, they've got their whole lives ahead of them. They've got all these ways of interacting with one another on the internet. Why should they be lonely? Well, actually, the social media has proven to be more of a problem for loneliness, although you can interact, but it's not in person. You can't actually touch the individual. You don't necessarily see their expressions and that sort of thing. And you can get overwhelmed by social media. So it's been found that half of all young people ages 11 to 17 receive 277 or more phone prompts every day, a quarter of which happen while they're in school, and about 5% of them happen during the night when they're supposed to be sleeping, and during the rest of their time. So they're constantly being bombarded with these signals coming in. It's not in person. And people tend to try to put their best foot forward. They may even lie about what's really going on in their lives. And when you see what the others claim that they're doing, what's going on with them, you think, oh my gosh, I'm a real slug. I don't have that many friends, and I haven't gotten all these awards. And neither have they, but they tell you they are. So it's called the comparison trap. You compare yourself to others, and very important for adolescents to have the good peer relationships, and that's a lot of what they learn from is their peer experience. So bullying is another serious problem online. Oddly enough, it seems to be more of an issue among girls. One of the theories is that when boys have a problem with one another, they get into a fist fight, and then when it's over, they shake hands and move on. But girls use reputation ruining and bullying online, and sometimes results in suicide. So not enough in-person relationship is one of the factors. Another one is sort of general fears about what's going on in the world and what are they facing in their lives. They know about climate change as being an issue, and are we going to be overwhelmed with climate problems, the risk of war. The pandemic was pretty frightening for them, and it took them away from their friends, and they had to deal with school from a distance. And they may be aware that the epidemiologists tell us without question it's not whether we'll have another pandemic, it's just when. They know for absolute certitude there will be more pandemics, it's a given. We just don't know exactly when or which specific organism it will be. They see the breakdown of law and order, a decrease in confidence in the government and other organizations like that. And they're also very worried about finances. And when you think of it, imagine that you're, say, a sophomore in college, and you're thinking, gosh, when I graduate, I'm going to owe $75,000. I'm majoring in ancient Egyptian history, and I'm not sure how that's going to get me a job that will enable me to pay for all this. I would like to get married and have children and have a home, but how can I afford all that and pay off these debts? And by the way, I'm really aware that we're in inflationary times, and my money's going to be worth less. And they're aware that we're having a massive national debt. And what some of them think is, gosh, the older folks are expecting me to pay for this. Now, they know what the debt is because it's plastered all over, and it's right now $33 trillion. Now, if you're like me, you say, what's really a trillion? I know it's a big number, but what does that represent? So one way is by trying to compare it to something. So imagine that someone was willing to count to 1 trillion, and every second they would count another number. So they'd count up to 60 in 1 minute, because there are 60 seconds in a minute. And they keep going like that until they hit 1 trillion. And the question is, well, how long would it take you to do that? Now, as an aside, it's not even possible. For one thing, some numbers get so big, it would take you about 8 seconds just to say the number. So you'd have to have a machine doing it. So the machine every second clicks off another number. And it gets up to 1 trillion. How long would it take? A week, a month, a year? What do you think? Well, it turns out 31,709 years to count to 1 trillion if you counted every single second, 24 hours a day, every day of the year, over 31,000 years for 1 trillion. Well, what about 33 trillion? It would take you 1,046,397 years. So they kind of know that, not in detail like I've given you, and they're thinking, wait a minute, how are people in my generation going to pay that off? Now, I am worried about my school debts. I'm worried about being able to buy a home and get married and have kids, and they're overwhelmed by it. So you add all these things in, and of course, they're young. They range in age from 11 to 26. And when you're 25, that's when your brain stops the pruning process, and you finally reach brain maturity. So at that very upper end, they have some level of brain maturation, but below that, they don't. And they have problems with problem solving and impulse control and that sort of thing. So they're in a tough spot. So those are the reasons, as far as we understand, why they are the loneliest. And honestly, I do feel sorry for those folks. Next slide. So this is a little bit more about why that was specifically the Gen Z. We're now in Gen Alpha. That's the next group. But they're, 10 and less in years. So they have a whole different set of issues, but they did miss out on a lot of schooling. But in this age range, we know from adult development that this is a time when you expect dealing with intimacy versus role confusion. What's my role in the world? So identity is, who am I? What are my values? What do I want to be? What are my talents? What am I bad at? Am I friendly? Am I not? That's your identity. Well, if you don't succeed in that, then you're going to have role confusion. That's what Erik Erikson figured out. So if you have role confusion, then you're kind of lost. You're kind of at sea without a rudder. And that's what's going to happen in this age range if they're not successful. And a lot of your sense of identity comes from your peer interactions, as well as, from what you're learning in school, from the family that you grow up in, if you're a church, the church that you attend, all plays a role in forming your identity, who you are, and what matters. We already mentioned they're dependent on peer norms and social media. They tend to have more conflicted and problematic relationships, less in-person contact due to the pandemic. Their brains are still developing. And what half of them say when interviewed, they say, what I really want is for someone, ideally an adult, but someone that I would care about, who says to me, how are you doing? And they really mean it. They rarely get that. It's more like, hey, how you doing? And then move on. What they want is for people to see them, that they do exist, that they do matter. And people want to know, how are you doing? So that's one of the things we can all do for people in that age group. Next slide. So why is loneliness getting worse, and therefore why we're talking about it now? Well, we already talked about the pandemic. Working from home is one of the things that occurred as a result of the pandemic, was learned people can do a lot of things from their home. And that has a lot of advantages, but it also means you don't have personal physical interaction with your coworkers and your boss and that sort of thing. Interestingly, people in Gen Z, when they are working, say they want their boss to talk to them as a unique individual every week, at least once a week. And the bosses all think, well, these are young people, they just want a text message, so that's what they get. So they're very disappointed. Amazon, I use that just as an example of where you can stay in your home, your apartment, or whatever, and never leave, and yet get food delivered, clothing, you name it. You can get it online, and it will be dropped off at your front door. No need to interact with human beings. We talked about the decline in trust in others, less social engagement, and just sort of social media versus in person. So these are some of the factors that's making this loneliness epidemic get worse. Next slide. So we know that loneliness now is very common. It's getting worse. We kind of know why. We know the risks. We know the harms, severe physical and mental health problems, and shortened lifespans. Well, what do we do about it? So next slide. One of the first things to do if you are lonely, or if you know someone who's lonely, is for them or you to figure out what is my specific cause. So if you are lonely because you're depressed, and depressed people tend to withdraw from social situations, and if you're deeply enough depressed and it's gone on long enough, you won't have any friends around because you've withdrawn from them. You don't want to interact. If that's the reason, you need to do something about your depression. Anxiety can also do that. Is it because you're isolated? You live in a rural community? Is it because you have a problem with ambulation, you don't have a car, you don't have any way of getting around? Is that the problem? Is it because of the way that you think, your mindset makes you more vulnerable? For example, if you tend to be very critical of yourself and others, it's harder to have friends that you can then trust and rely on. People don't like being criticized regularly by someone. If you have the expectation that you're going to be rejected because, well, I'm not that interesting and nobody really likes me and I'm not that attractive, and then you're going to be pulling away from people, and so you'll be lonely. Well, you can do things about that. Next slide. If you avoid social situations, you're invited by someone to come to a party and you say, well, no, I don't know anybody there, so I don't want to go. If you have problems with your hearing, that means when you get together with people, especially in a noisy environment, then you can't really talk to them because you can't hear what they're saying. And so what do? You pull back and you withdraw. Same thing can happen with vision loss or other disabilities like ambulation problems. Lack of transportation, especially a problem if you're in a rural setting, for instance. Or this is an issue that they've looked at among our senior citizens. If they don't know much about video chats, smartphones, and tablets and such, in New York they developed a training program specifically for senior citizens who didn't grow up with these things. And by teaching them about FaceTime, for example, now they can FaceTime their children and grandchildren. They can at least have that degree of interaction. And so that's been helpful for them. Not as good as in person, but better than nothing. Next slide. So manage the cause. If you're depressed, anxious, or have personality factors like we talked about, well, therapy would be an appropriate response. Vision or hearing loss, get medical treatment for those. You can get your cataracts removed, you can get glasses, you can get hearing aids, and so on. If you simply have limited contact with other people, maybe using various social resources like community centers and that sort of thing. If you have transportation problems, maybe you can invite other people to come to your home, or you can use Zoom or FaceTime. You can always use Lyft or just get help from other people that you know to be able to get together with others. Next slide. So find out the cause and deal with the cause. And for all of us, we need to maintain social fitness just like we need to maintain physical and mental fitness. Your relationships, whatever they are, with your family, friends, colleagues, they need ongoing attention. Don't leave it to chance. So these are two good questions to ask yourself. Where am I spending my time? And do I tend to my connections? Do I pick up the phone and call them? Or do I say, well, I called them first the last 3 times. I'm going to wait for them to call me, and then they never do. No, you take responsibility because it's your loneliness, your life. You need to work on it. Next slide. Making new friends, if you don't have enough, you can volunteer. We have plenty of opportunities in this church if you're interested, but there are obviously volunteer opportunities everywhere. Albert Schweitzer was a famous physician, surgeon. He also was a concert level musician, and he actually used that to raise money because he was a missionary, and he went to Africa and spent years there taking care of those individuals and training them in modern healthcare things. And he said one thing that's always stuck with me, and he said, I don't know what you will do in your life, but unless you're serving others, you will not be happy. You can join a club. If you like chess, join a chess club. If you like to read, a reading group. Whatever it is, take a class. It turns out that St. Petersburg branch here in Tarpon Springs, if you're a senior citizen, you can take and audit any of the classes that they offer for free. It's a good price. So that's just an example of what you can do. And join some group that has an interest like you. In the case of these three guys, it's bowling. Join a bowling group. Next slide. The American Association of Retired Persons, or AARP, have a number of formal programs. These are three of them. One is called the Experience Corps, and they link a senior citizen with a student. And the student may do things for them, and the senior citizen might even help them, though, with things, especially if it's a young student. They might even help to coach them with their studies. Friendly Voice program is a program that they have where seniors talk to each other, but the organization sets that up for you. And they have a virtual community center for those who can't get out of their house and go to one. So they're a real opportunity. They have a lot of programs, and so if you join AARP, you can learn about them, and that can be a help for you if you're in that age group. Next slide. Other options, if you have a pet, like a dog anyway, take it for a walk or go to the dog park. People who like animals will often come up to you then and say, oh, your dog is so wonderful, and they want to pet your dog, and that sort of thing. It's one way to meet people. Online dating or social network apps can be appropriate depending on your situation. Talk to your neighbors. They're not that far away. Join a gym. If you're a senior citizen and you get silver sneakers, you can join a gym. You can actually, if you have silver sneakers, you can join as many gyms as you want. Now, why you would join more than one or two, I don't know. But I signed up for Anytime Fitness here in Tarpon Springs, and it's an outstanding facility. They have well-trained coaches available for you, excellent equipment. And I don't pay anything. That's just part of my insurance. Go to a community center or a recreation center. Next slide. This is just a little humor. I guess it's humorous. I'm so glad being socially distant does not mean including my dog. Some people love their animals more than they love people, sometimes with reason. There is a joke, which I'll just take a moment to tell you. If you want to know whether your spouse loves you more or your dog, put them both into the trunk of your car, come back in an hour, and see who's glad to see you. Next slide. I'm not suggesting that. That's a joke, right? Get it? For teenagers, parents and other adults should proactively ask about their friends. And remember, they already want you to say, how are you doing, and mean it. You really want to hear them. It's not just a polite thing to say. There is a program called Bring Change to Mind. It's a program that's in some high schools. I don't know if there are any of the local high schools here, but that is set up to help them forming relationships. And teens need to learn about mental illness, and you need to create an empathic environment for them that they can share with you that they're feeling anxious and hear what they have to say. Next slide. Hugs, the power of human touch. So some people say, well, why can't we just do this all online? Why do we have to be close to one another physically. And one reason is for hugs. Now, my wife, who has some expertise in these kinds of things, said you need 8 hugs a day for optimal living. But if you get any, that's better than none for sure. We know that physical touch is incredibly powerful and necessary. So, for example, in Romania, they had a lot of orphans back during the World Wars, and they had these rows and rows of babies in bassinets in a large room. And when researchers went in there, they were shocked by the fact that they couldn't hear anything. No babies were crying or making any noises. And when they inquired why that was, it was because the babies only ever got physical attention when it was time to be fed or they needed to have their diaper changed. So at most 2 or 3 times a day. And what happened is those babies gave up because they knew when they cried, no one would ever come. And those individuals, when they were followed over the years, at age 14, they had a lot of cognitive and emotional difficulties. We need physical touch, we need physical contact, beginning as babies and through the rest of our lives. There's one experiment on human touch and its power that's always stuck with me because it sort of surprised me that it wouldn't make any difference. And this was an experiment using a library in the old days when they had books and you had to have a library card, and you'd go in and you'd check out your book or books and you'd hand your library card to the technician behind the desk. And in the experiment, the tech was told to take the card, and for half of the people who were leaving with their book, make sure you kind of touch their hand as you're taking the card from them. And the others, make sure you don't touch their hand, just take the card. And outside of the library was a researcher with a clipboard, and he would say, "Excuse me, we're doing an interview on people with their satisfaction with the library." And what they found was the people whose hand was briefly brushed as the tech was taking their card thought that the library services were way better than those whose hand was not even briefly touched. Touch is amazingly powerful. So that's one of the problems with being very isolated, whether it's necessary or just voluntary. Next slide. Don't forget church. If you did you say that? I'm not surprised he would say that. Yeah. No, we talked about community is one of the very powerful things you get from belonging to a church, but it's not enough to join. You actually have to go. It's like the guy who complained that he wasn't getting any stronger, didn't feel any healthier despite having joined the health club, and the owner said, but you have to come. So the same thing with church. So go to events at church, volunteer, lots of opportunities, I'm sure, in virtually any church that you want to join. And you can meet new people by being a greeter, greeting new people as they come into your church. Next slide. So those are my prepared remarks. I'll take questions, but also comments. If you have thoughts that you'd like to share, I'll be happy to take those. Before we actually start, to give me the next slide, I do write a blog on a regular basis. It's on WordPress, and if you're curious about it, it's mostly health topics, some of them mental health, but most of them are general medical topics. They're about 2-minute reads each. And so to access it, you just type in phartman01.wordpress.com, and it takes you directly to my site. So I know there are some people, including our pastor's wife, who has accessed it, so I thought I'd make it known if you're curious and want to do that. Feel free. I don't get paid or anything, but I am trying to provide education to the general public. So, questions? We have a microphone, so I can hear you.
I'll try to start singing. Early on, you talked about one of the things from the Harvard study that helps prolong your life and improves your health, and that was positive relationships. Mm-hmm. Would you define what you think positive relationships are and how that compares to negative relationships?
Well, sure. I think there are certain common sense ways to think of it, but it really has to do with the depth of the relationship. What you need is a minimum of one and ideally at least 3 people that if you have a serious concern or you need some advice or you need some direct help, I'm trying to get this furniture moved and I need somebody to help me, that if you call them, they will show up for you. That you can share with them your deepest secrets and thoughts and worries and concerns, and you feel safe in doing that. So those are positive relationships. And in marriage, it's not a matter of having a certificate is the issue, but it's having a deep connection with another human being. It's the real reason why you tend to live longer. Both men and women live longer if they're married, if it's a good marriage. So those are, generally speaking, what that means, yeah.
Hey, Dr. Hartman, thank you for doing this for us.
Sure.
And one question I have regarding veterans and military. A lot of help is offered when veterans have issues, be it PTSD or moral injury or whatever, something that falls outside of the group norm. Mm-hmm. Do you know if any loneliness or an issue of loneliness has been addressed or is being discussed within our military and veteran community?
I actually don't know anything specific, though I'm a veteran myself. Sadly, our American Legion is closing down for financial reasons here. But there are organizations like that, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, and the VA does have, as you say, a lot of medical and psychiatric services available. But whether they've developed a specific program to deal with loneliness among veterans, I am not aware. I don't know. They may well have. We have somebody with a microphone. She's coming around.
I'm backing up to the first question. It was about somebody moving your furniture, and then you talk to them too? I don't get that.
No, I'm saying that you need someone in your life that you could call if you need help. I just use help as an example would be you need to
Okay.
move furniture and you can't do it
Well,
by yourself.
how do you find these people?
Say it again?
How do you find these people?
Oh, how do you find them? Well, that's where we talked about, joining a group,
Okay,
joining the
you
church.
already-
No, do
okay,
all.
I get it.
Be proactive in it and
Okay.
call people that you know. Don't wait for them to call you
Okay,
and that sort of thing.
thank you.
Sure.
I just wanted to reemphasize something that you said. Something that I've learned in the ministry early on is one of my mentors in training said, when you visit someone, they may never remember what you said, but they'll remember that you were there. Especially people going through trauma or whatnot. But when I go to the hospital, for example, one thing that I learned early on is I will always touch their hand. Just hold their hand, maybe touch the side of their leg, something like that. And so I just want to emphasize the healing power of touch is so very important. And if you come to this church, you get a hug.
Yeah.
If you go like this to me, then you won't. But and it's infectious because then I think there's permission in that modeling for other people to get a hug. Obviously, it needs to be safe, and it's good to ask permission if you don't know the person. But I just speak to that power. So I know a lot of you would go visit people in a hospital or go by to someone who's lonely, and to kind of just lean in and hold their hand has more power than you realize, where sometimes we're thinking, I need to say something profound, or I need to have a magic wand. There is no magic wand, but healing, touch is very, very healing. So.
Hugh Hewitt on the radio recently said that their generation, which is my generation, older people, they used to play outside. Teenage boys used to get together and have friendships and really bond together, And like a Hugh Hewitt, I mean, he's so like healthy and and they grew up without a lot of hang-ups and stuff, whereas this generation, they don't bond together. They're on their iPads or their phones all the time, and then they were cut out of school during COVID. So he says they're just really, he's really worried about them, and the other man agreed. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely, yes. That's part of the challenge. One of the saddest things to see is two teenage girls sitting side by side, and they're on their phones. They're actually sending messages to each other, but they're sitting right next to each other. And I've seen that. And you go to a restaurant, and they're a family at a table, and all of them are looking at their devices rather than talking to each other and looking at one another. It's really sad. But that helps to fuel this epidemic of loneliness.
I would say that's not exclusive to young people either.
No, it's not exclusive to young people.
So the question I have is how to help someone. My daughter, she's 18, her and her friends mostly have conversations on the phone or they play games online. I'm like, why won't you get out? And so many young people don't even get their driver's license these days to get out. And then my older sister, who says she's bored or doesn't have anything to do or, all these things, and she's alone. And I'm like, take a class. Why don't you volunteer? But it's like, how do you help someone get out of whatever this is that's holding them back? Because I don't want to just be in their face all the time. Get out, do something, get out, be with people. But I know there's something missing.
Sure. Well, that's a common scenario, unfortunately, and as parents, you really want the best for your kids, and you understand that being alone and lonely is not a good thing for them. So one of the things that they've said that they really want is for someone to ask them how they're doing and to really mean it, and to ask them about their friends. Hey, how's Sally doing now? You tell me she was struggling with whatever. And truly be interested in what they have to say. There are programs, as I say, and some high schools have specialized programs. A number of colleges do as well. I was a part-time consultant psychiatrist for a college in Pennsylvania, and a number of those kids were lonely and didn't have friends. A surprising number had a social anxiety disorder, which is a real disorder where they really struggle with being able to interact and make friends. They had a massive problem if they were in a class where they had to give a presentation on a topic that they had studied, and they freeze. They just can't do it. And it's really prevalent in that age group, that sort of thing. So it gets back to finding out the cause. What's the reason? What is holding back the older sister from making friends? Is she depressed? Depression and anxiety are quite common in that age group, and they may not own up to it unless you somehow ask them. If there's another adult that they like and respect, also that's helpful. Sometimes they'll tell a pastor or one of their teachers or the school counselor something that they won't tell their parents for whatever reason. So getting help from others. Maybe you could even share with them what you've learned here about how loneliness is not just feels bad, but it's bad for your physical and your mental health. And, how can I help? That's also another thing that's particularly good with the elderly, they say, hey, how can I help? But it should also be helpful for teenagers. They're a tough group. Yeah. She's going to hand out the microphones, yeah.
My problem is I worry about my kids. I keep them isolated. I mean, I did when they were little. Now my grandkids I worry about trafficking. I mean, I don't want my kids to be stolen, and that's what I say to my kids. You need to be right here where I can touch you and see you so that you don't get stolen.
Yeah.
And I think that might contribute to keeping our kids away from, other, you don't let them out of your sight, you don't let them away.
Right.
Where they can actually bond and make friends.
Yeah, there's always a balancing act between protection and overly protecting your kids so that they can't learn how to deal with the problems that occur in life. I do think it was a bit safer years ago. I mean, all of us would play until it got dark, and then we'd go home. Parents had no idea where we went, but they generally felt we were going to be safe. Now, sometimes it wasn't the case. But you also have to look at it statistically, how likely is it to happen? It depends on your community and other factors. But it is a balancing act. And, you want to do the right thing. You don't want them to get kidnapped, but on the other hand, you don't want them to become lonely. So you have to weigh those. And I think it's an individualized decision based on how savvy those kids are, what kind of community you specifically live in, and can you transport them then safely, for example, to hang out with friends at their house and have their friends come to your house and that sort of thing to increase the likelihood that they'll have good relationships.
I'd like to tell you a little story.
Okay.
I was sitting in church one day. My husband was next to me, but I was feeling very alone. Thinking about my parents that have passed, no siblings really close. And then it must have been the Holy Spirit, because Pastor Kurt was up there giving his sermon, and he said, "Did you know you are never alone? Your Father is always with you." That has helped me so much.
Okay, that's a great story. Thank you.
Yeah, Pete, I believe technology has a lot to do with loneliness. When I drive out in the morning and the kids on the sidewalk waiting for the bus, they don't talk to each other. Each one has a cell phone, and they're looking at it, the cell phone, and when they exit the bus, they still have the cell phone in the hand. And when I go somewhere else and the people are waiting, they all have the cell phone in the hand. Nobody talks to each other. So technology, has really done some bad things here for loneliness.
Yeah, technology is a two-edged sword. It can help with certain kinds of loneliness, like if you can't get out of your house, you can at least FaceTime with your kids and your grandkids. But if that's all you do, then that's a problem. And unfortunately, so many are basically addicted to it. It's like with the different kind of video games that kids play. What has been shown is that they get a dopamine hit, which is the pleasure chemical in the brain. It lights up your pleasure center. And just like addiction to anything, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or in this case, video games, when you stop, you go through withdrawal and you feel down and irritable. And parents notice when they take away the video games, say, you got to stop now, you got to do your homework. The kids get really irritable and can do some bad things. And it's because they're going through a withdrawal. And so some of the child psychologists recommend that parents be aware that that's what's happening. That's why they're irritable. And just give them a break of time before then you try to get them to do their homework, for example. So it's definitely a two-edged sword and not all good for sure.
I was thinking about the topic, what you were talking about, loneliness, and my mind went straight to nursing homes. And in nursing homes is really, loneliness is really out there for them. That's because people put their parents in nursing homes, and they leave the work to the workers, and the workers cannot give that love, give that time to the people that's in the nursing homes, and it does the loneliness of them being there on them. They don't live long. They may live long, but their health really go down. So the loneliness is really, just you talking about it in my mind just really went there, because I used to go there with my church members. We used to go there and have a little service with them, and they would be so happy, because somebody from the outside came in and just gave them some attention, gave them some love, and gave them some hugs, kisses and whatnot. So loneliness is real, and it does affect people who are in the nursing homes, because they have no family members, no friends. And this was something I was really shocked about, to find out that there was individuals that family members, they never had any visitors come, and it's real bad. So don't put your family in a nursing home a member of your, and forget about them.
Excellent point. Let me ask you something, if you don't mind. Was it also good for you? Yes.
Yes, I told my children, don't you ever put me in a nursing home.
Yeah. Okay. I like that one. Yeah. Well, yeah. Usually, when you try to help someone else, like apparently these were strangers and that you came to see, you often would feel better yourself. But that's also a good thing to tell your kids. Don't put me in a nursing home. Yeah.
As a young adult, right out of high school, I worked in a nursing home. And I'm glad that you talked about this because I experienced people drop people off and they don't ever come back to see them. So I've been, all my life, have been very active with older people. Now I'm becoming older, but it's very important. They are left there. They are extremely lonely.
Yeah. No, all good points. And it's particularly sad during the pandemic because family members that wanted to visit could not, at least not in person. We used to drive by a nursing home, and there would be little kids with their parents looking through a window, and the grandparent who's in the nursing home looking at them. There's no physical touch, and they just have to see one another through a window. And the pandemic really, really harmed us in many ways. And the loneliness problem has skyrocketed.
I want to make the connection between what Kim mentioned about how do you motivate folks that, let's say, brothers or sisters or someone in your family to get out, and then also a connection with children and kind of how do you do that fine line of protection, but at the same time getting them in social situations. And also with children dropping their parents off at nursing homes and forgetting about them, but then parents also dropping their kids off and not paying attention to them. I mean, so what I want to say is this. You don't know what you're doing when you start out as a parent, and you kind of learn along the way. And one of the things that came to mind for me is really the cross and getting back to the cross. When I look at love, cross is I'm going to lay down my life for the people who are right in front of me. And I learned that about parenting too, is like it's very inconvenient because you have to stop your life and pay attention to that person, right? And so I think one of the ways we can be agents is when that sister's in the home, and like I don't want to. I'll go with you. Let's go bowl. I don't know, and invite someone else or that sort of thing. With your kids, okay? I'm afraid that they'll be abducted, right? And that was a very real thing here in Pinellas County, which is a hotbed for human trafficking. So we raised our kids here. But we can make sure that they get to places where they can socialize with people. And so I think to some extent, for those of us who still have vision, to be able to I'll go with you. There's a difference when someone says, well, how do I get to that store here in Tarpon Springs? Well, you go down here to the light, and you take a left, and you'll pass by this store, and then you go there, and then you kind of go, I'll just take you there. And you go with them, and you have a conversation along the way. And so part of it, I think, too, is we care enough about loneliness is when the people are around us, you may have to stop your life and kind of go, let's go there together. And it just occurs to me that can be part of the solution as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate something about visiting people in rest homes and in conjunction with the importance of touch. My father retired to Florida. I was living in California. I had an older brother who had many health issues who was in Michigan. But that's ultimately where we ended up, when my father got dementia, having to place him in a facility in Michigan. And he was there 4 years before he passed. And since I lived so far away, I definitely did visit, but I couldn't be a daily visitor. And the friend sitting next to me lived in the area, and her part of her avocation as a retired person now and during her work career was Reiki and healing touch. And although my father physically was a tough guy, World War II vet, but she touched a lot of people in that place, total strangers who had no visitors. She always, of course, spent time with him and touched his hip that hurt. But I know the times that I was there when she was also there to visit, a complete stranger, particularly with dementia. People who have dementia, it's hard for the family to be around them because they don't know what to do or say. Sometimes a complete stranger who's empathetic and touches can bring a smile to that person with dementia that you just can't believe. So touch and visiting people that are shut away is very important. And I want to thank my friend Wendy.
Yep, very good.
I have macular degeneration, so I've lost most of my eyesight. Well, lucky for you, I don't drive, but that has been a problem for me, which has been solved by having friends who are willing to bring me to church and take me to doctors and so forth. So if you knew someone that is in that kind of situation where for whatever reason they aren't able to get themselves to places, and if you offer to do this, it not only helps them, but I think it'll give you a good feeling also.
Yep. Thanks for sharing that.
I wasn't going to say anything, Helen. This has been very meaningful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would just like to say, and we've hit on this, there are different stages of loneliness. But what I've found is a routine. Oh, hey, that helps. A routine of starting my days out with devotionals, with gratitude for another day, for walking outside my house. And there might not be anybody, but maybe just one neighbor, because everybody sort of stays within themselves. But just to talk and say hello and how are you helps me. And so I think if we could just, of course, communicate, and church is a family. It is a family. And I consider that wonderful. And somebody asked me, how long have you been a member of St. Timothy? And so, yeah, over there she is, Evelyn. And when I told her that we moved to Tarpon in 1964 and was introduced to the Lutheran church, it's not this one here, but we met in Sunset Hill School. I've been a member, my husband and I have been a member of this church since 1964. So it's family.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. By the way, you couldn't see this, but people behind you were shaking their heads yes as you were talking, yeah.
I wanted to mention when the conversation came up about the youth and their isolation and not having safe places for them to go to, that many of our churches have programs for youth on different days of the week, and those are safe and guided programs. Also, some years ago, I attended a church, and one of the things I noticed is, there would be neighbors and groups together that would come with the kids or bring the kids in, and the next thing you know, the parents would join the church. The children would bring the families together in the church. So that's one of the things, especially because you were concerned about your children's safety, that if you have them in church programs, they will be safe.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. One last question from me. In your experience, you had mentioned bullying and our social media and loneliness. Do you see an association between loneliness and bullying? As far as like from the bully's perspective?
Not so much from the bullied person's perspective, no, although they do tend to have a higher incidence of various, what we'll call psychological or even mental issues themselves, part of what drives them. Now, I'm aware that it's actually a little bit after 2 o'clock, so it's officially over, but I will be happy to stay for anyone who wants to continue with it. But if you need to go because you were planning on an hour, please feel free to get up and go. No one will feel badly, but if you want to stay because you're interested in more, then I'm happy to stay.
That just made me think, as grandparents, and I think we probably got a lot of them here, you can do an awful lot. There's some joke about dragging your kids to school or something and how they, but when we're up in Michigan, we take the grandkids and the service itself is just Bible talk, and it's not entertaining in that sense, and they love it every age of them, but they're glad that we think enough of them to take them, so.
Yeah, that's great, yeah.